The hard part about Sandra Bullock is that the world thinks it knows her through motion and triumph. A woman outrunning danger and speed, floating through catastrophe and gravity, holding the line with a steady smile while Hollywood crowns her reliability. But real tragedy does not arrive like a script cue. It arrives when the house is quiet and the phone does not stop vibrating, when the person who made the world feel safe is suddenly not there, and when grief is still fresh enough to blur your vision, yet the outside world is already demanding a reaction. On August 2023, Brian Randall, Bullock's longtime partner, died after a private battle with ALS, and the public learned what her inner circle had carried in silence for years, that their life had been organized around caregiving, protection, and a kind of disciplined love that does not need cameras to exist. In the days that followed, there was no spectacle, only absence, and for someone who has spent decades learning how to keep her personal life out of reach, the loss was not a headline. It was the removal of a stabilizing pulse from the center of a home. Bullock has 2 children, and the math of that kind of grief is cruelly practical, because you do not get to collapse the way your body wants to collapse when small lives still need breakfast, homework, and reassurance that tomorrow will still arrive. In private, the smallest routines become unbearable. The extra mug set out by reflex, the chair that stays empty, the hallway that no longer carries the familiar sound of another adult moving through it. And then the second blade, because tragedy in her life has rarely been content to stay singular. Within weeks, a new wave of noise rose around the blind side when Michael O'Hare filed a legal petition accusing the Toohey family of misleading him into a conservatorship, pulling the story that once defined Bullock's most celebrated awards moment back in a public dispute. She was not a party to the alleged agreements. She did not negotiate anyone's rights, but the internet does not care about clean lines when emotions are hungry. Social media chatter swelled into demands that she should return her Oscar, as if an actor can retroactively rewrite the real world, as if a performance can be punished for a controversy it never controlled. Imagine the timing. Standing inside, fresh morning, while strangers argue about your moral responsibility for a narrative you embodied on screen years earlier. It is not just unfair, it is psychologically violent, because it tries to convert grief into a public courtroom where the only acceptable outcome is more noise. Bullock's tragedy has never been only about loss. It is also about exposure, the way a famous woman is expected to be both human and untouchable at the same time, punished for being private, yet punished again for being visible. That tension has haunted her for years, and it did not begin in 2023. In June 2014, an intruder broke into her home in Los Angeles, forcing her into a moment of pure survival, locking herself away and calling 911 as police responded to a man later identified as Joshua James Corbett. Events like that do not simply end when the handcuffs click, they echo. They make you distrust the ordinary. They turn silence into a threat instead of a comfort. When you layer betrayal, intrusion, and grief on top of each other, something changes in the nervous system. The body becomes a historian, storing fear in places you cannot negotiate with logic. And still, the public image persists, the calm face at premieres, the controlled humor in interviews, the posture of a woman who seems unbreakable because she rarely lets you see the cost. Sandra Bullock was born on July 26, 1964, and by 2026, she is 61, an age where most people start measuring life not by ambition, but by what remains, what is worth protecting, what cannot be replaced. Her story at this point is not about box office numbers or red carpet power. It is about the brutal mismatch between fame and safety, between success and shelter, between being adored by millions and still lying awake at night, listening for sounds that should not be there. And if you have ever wondered what it looks like when a celebrated life is forced into ordinary human suffering, when strength is not a brand but a daily decision, then you are standing at the edge of the chapter that explains everything the applause never could. Before the world learned to associate Sandra Bullock with calm, authority, and box office certainty, Her life was shaped by a kind of discipline that leaves marks long before success ever arrives. She did not grow up inside chaos, but inside control. Born into a household where performance was not a choice, but a schedule, she learned early that precision mattered more than comfort. Her mother, a respected opera singer, filled grand halls across Europe with sound, while her father brought military structure and vocal training into the home. Applause existed, but it was never casual. It was earned, rehearsed for, and measured against expectation. Childhood, for Sandra, did not unfold in one stable place. It moved constantly across Germany and Austria, from city to city, stage to stage. By the time many children learn how to belong, she had already learned how temporary belonging can be. Each relocation arrived with the same lesson. Friendships dissolve quickly, rooms empty faster than expected, and the safest posture is readiness to leave. Music surrounded her, but did not soothe her body. Years later, she would describe how even beautiful environments can still train a child to stay tense, how applause can coexist with anxiety, how the stomach tightens even when the notes are correct. When she returned to the United States in the mid-1970s, the adjustment was not a relief, it was a collision. What had once made her unique abroad became a target at home. Her accent, her clothes, her mannerisms marked her as different, and difference rarely travels alone in school hallways. Mockery replaced curiosity. Laughter landed without invitation. The message was not subtle. Visibility carries risk. She adapted the way many quiet children do, by learning to scan rooms before speaking, by understanding where to stand so attention would pass over her instead of through her. Those years trained her instincts long before they ever served her career. She learned to notice who was ignored, who was swallowed by noise, who learned to disappear to survive. That awareness never left her. It did not harden into bitterness. Instead, it sharpened into perception, an ability to read emotional undercurrents that would later give her performances their restraint and depth. By the time she reached college at East Carolina University, studying drama, the idea of performance had shifted. It was no longer inherited obligation, it was chosen work. But choosing it did not make it easier. In 1986, just short of completing her degree, she made a decision that peeled away the last layer of protection. She left certainty behind and went to New York City with no safety net and no famous surname to open doors. What followed was not romantic struggle, it was attrition. Auditions that ended in silence. Roles that never materialized. Days spent chasing possibility and nights spent working to afford survival. She waited tables, tended bars, checked coats, and climbed cold stairwells back to cramped apartments where heat was unreliable and meals were repetitive. There was help available, but she refused it. She wanted to know if she could stand on her own. If failure came, she wanted to be honest. Those years offered very little validation. Films came and went without impact. Titles disappeared almost as soon as they were announced. The industry did not reject her loudly. It rejected her quietly, which is often harder to endure. Still, she stayed. Rejection did not humiliate her. It instructed her. She learned how to work when no one was watching, how to rehearse in empty rooms, how to build stamina without applause. In 1993, momentum finally appeared, but without fireworks. A supporting role in Demolition Man placed her near recognizable faces, close enough to be noticed but not celebrated. Then came the moment that reshaped everything. Speed was not designed for her. The role of Annie Porter circulated among actresses the industry already trusted. She was not an obvious choice. What she brought instead was vulnerability stripped of pretense. Her audition was simple, improvised, built from imagination rather than polish. A folding chair stood in for a bus seat. A paper plate replaced a steering wheel. The chemistry with her co-star was immediate, unforced, alive. When the film exploded at the box office, earning hundreds of millions worldwide, it did more than make her famous. It altered the terms of her existence overnight. The woman who had rationed meals suddenly became indispensable. Offers multiplied. Expectations hardened. Success, however, did not erase the lessons that came before it. If anything, it activated them. She understood how quickly favor can disappear, how thin the line is between being needed and being replaced. Instead of surrendering to momentum, she anchored herself. She formed her own production company, choosing stories carefully, building a career that allowed her to say no when others feared losing ground. Romantic comedies followed, then dramas, then moments of critical recognition that confirmed what audiences already felt, that her strength lay in understatement. Yet even as her professional life stabilized, her personal life did not offer immunity. Fame widened exposure. Privacy narrowed. The same instincts that once helped her survive school hallways now had to operate under relentless public scrutiny. She married, hoping for normalcy, for partnership that felt grounded rather than performative. What followed instead was betrayal revealed publicly, at the precise moment her career reached its most celebrated peak. That collision taught her another lesson, one more severe than rejection or obscurity, that triumph and devastation can arrive together, and that the world will celebrate one while consuming the other. By the time motherhood entered her life, it did so amid fracture rather than stability. She did not retreat from that responsibility. She narrowed her focus, protected her child, and learned how to move through grief without letting it define the environment her child would grow up in. That discipline would be tested again and again, through fear, intrusion, and later, through illness and loss. When people speak about Sandra Bullock's tragedy, they often isolate one event, one scandal, one death. The truth is more cumulative. Her life has been a series of pressures applied over time, shaping a kind of endurance that does not announce itself. Part 2 of her story is not about the rise everyone remembers. It is about the preparation no one saw, the quiet conditioning that made it possible for her to keep standing when life later demanded more than fame could ever protect. By the time Sandra Bullock reached the height of her professional authority, the world assumed she had arrived somewhere safe. Awards accumulated, box office records solidified her reliability, and her name became synonymous with stability in an industry addicted to volatility. But this phase of her life revealed a harsher truth, that security in public life often increases vulnerability in private ones. The more indispensable she became, the more exposed she was to forces she could not control. Her marriage to Jesse James initially appeared to offer what she had long been denied, an ordinary rhythm. Away from sound stages and premieres, there was the promise of shared routines, mutual responsibility, and a life not constantly measured by audience reaction. When they married in 2005, she believed quietly and sincerely that she had finally reached a plateau where ambition could soften into partnership. Together, they prepared to adopt a child, imagining a future anchored by shared commitment rather than constant movement. By early 2010, everything appeared aligned. Her career had reached an undeniable peak, her marriage seemed intact, and motherhood was imminent. Then, in the narrowest window imaginable, triumph and devastation collided. On March 2010, she stood beneath the Academy Awards lights and accepted the Oscar for her performance in The Blind Side, a role defined by compassion and steadiness. Applause thundered. Cameras flashed. The industry celebrated what it framed as a perfect narrative of success. Within days, that narrative collapsed. Revelations of her husband's infidelity erupted publicly, splintering her marriage in full view of the world. There was no private reckoning, no gradual unraveling. Betrayal arrived amplified, accelerated by headlines that left no room for processing. At the same time, she was finalizing the adoption of her son, Louis. The timing was merciless. She became a mother while simultaneously becoming a single parent, signing divorce papers with one hand while learning how to soothe an infant with the other. The contrast was unbearable. Publicly, she was honored for portraying a woman who offered stability to a child. Privately, she was fighting to create stability from wreckage. She did not speak. Silence became her shield. There were no interviews explaining her pain, no performances of resilience for sympathy. Instead, she withdrew, narrowing her world to what mattered most. Her priority was not reputation repair, but containment. Grief could exist, but it could not spill into the life depending on her steadiness. That instinct, to absorb damage rather than export it, will become one of the defining traits of her adulthood. The years that followed tested that discipline repeatedly. In 2014, fear entered her life in a form that stripped away every illusion of control. Late at night, alone in her Los Angeles home, she realized an intruder was inside. The moment was pure survival. She locked herself in a closet, whispered into a phone with emergency services on the line, and waited as time stretched unbearably thin. The man was arrested, but the impact did not end there. Trauma does not leave when danger is removed. It lodges itself in the body, reprogramming how safety is perceived. For someone who had already endured betrayal and public humiliation, this intrusion added a new dimension of vulnerability. Walls no longer guaranteed protection. Silence no longer signaled peace. She later acknowledged that fear followed her long after the incident, appearing unexpectedly, hijacking ordinary moments, reminding her that success does not confer immunity. The most terrifying realization was not her own fear, but the possibility that it could reach her son. That awareness reshaped her priorities again. Healing was no longer optional. She sought therapy not to appear strong, but to prevent fear from becoming an inheritance. Recovery became an act of care rather than self-preservation. In the midst of this recalibration, love returned quietly. There was no spectacle, no announcement, no attempt to rewrite her public image. Brian Randall entered her life not as a celebrity counterpart, but as someone grounded, observant, and unthreatened by her status. He met her as a mother first, as a person managing a home, not as a symbol. Their relationship grew slowly, built on presence rather than projection. When she adopted her daughter, Isla, from foster care, he stepped into the role of caregiver without hesitation. Together, they constructed a household defined by routine and gentleness, a space where vigilance could finally relax. For the first time in years, she experienced partnership that did not demand performance. Friends noted a change in her demeanor, a softening that suggested she was no longer braced for impact. That sense of refuge made the diagnosis that followed even more devastating. In 2020, Randall was diagnosed with ALS. The disease advanced relentlessly, eroding physical ability while leaving awareness intact. From that moment on, time reorganized itself around care. The decision to keep his illness private was deliberate. They refused to let the children experience life as a countdown. Normalcy became sacred. Birthdays were celebrated without medical framing. Mornings followed familiar rhythms. Inside the home, adaptations happened quietly. Furniture shifted. Equipment appeared gradually. Caregivers blended into daily life. Sandra learned new forms of listening as speech became difficult, new ways of understanding needs expressed through breath, expression, and touch. She stayed present through nights when sleep would not come, choosing proximity over escape. Humor survived wherever it could. Music filled rooms when words failed. These were not acts designed for admiration. They were repetitions of devotion, unseen and uncompromising. When Randall died in August 2023, the loss was total. There was no narrative to manage, no scandal to outlast. The absence permeated everything. Familiar routines fractured. Small gestures betrayed the reality of grief. An extra cup set out, a chair left untouched. What followed almost immediately was another collision between private devastation and public judgment. The controversy surrounding the blind side resurfaced, dragging her name back into debate at the precise moment she was least able to carry it. Though she had no involvement in the legal matters being contested, online discourse blurred responsibility into association. Calls for her to relinquish her Oscar emerged, as if symbolic punishment could address a grievance unrelated to her actions. Once again, she chose restraint. There were no defenses issued, no public corrections. She retreated into the same ground that had sustained her through earlier collapses, the unremarkable labor of being present for her children. Days continued. Lunches were packed. Homework was checked. Grief was contained, not erased, managed carefully so it would not become the atmosphere her children breathed. By the end of that year, she had endured compounded losses without spectacle. What emerges from this chapter is not the story of a celebrity navigating hardship, but of a woman whose life has demanded sustained emotional stamina. Her tragedy is not defined by a single moment, but by the accumulation of pressures absorbed without transfer. She has been betrayed publicly, frightened privately, tested repeatedly by illness and death, and judged at moments when mercy would have been more human. Yet she continues to choose care over retaliation, discipline over exposure, and grace over bitterness. Part 3 of her story is where endurance stops being theoretical and becomes lived practice, where strength is no longer something admired from a distance, but something exercised daily, quietly, without applause. By the time Sandra Bullock entered her 6th decade, endurance had become less about survival and more about stewardship. She had learned, through repetition rather than revelation, that life does not stop demanding simply because you have already paid a heavy price. What changes is the way you carry the weight. After years of retreat from the spotlight, her reemergence was never framed as a comeback. It was measured, intentional, and governed by a different calculus than ambition. Work was no longer a ladder. It was a filter. Projects were chosen for emotional honesty, for boundaries they respected, for the way they could coexist with a life centered on care. This recalibration became visible to the industry during Gravity, a film that placed her almost entirely alone on screen, suspended between silence and catastrophe. The performance was not loud. It was controlled, precise, and sustained by internal pressure rather than spectacle. Audiences responded with something rare: trust. The film's success reasserted her authority, not as a commodity, but as a presence capable of carrying risk without excess. That authority translated into leverage. Financially, she reached a level of independence that allowed choice to matter more than exposure. But money did not become display. It became insulation. Privacy, safety, and time emerged as the true assets she protected. In an industry that equates relevance with constant visibility, her deliberate absences became a form of control. She stepped back not because she had been pushed out, but because she understood that presence without purpose erodes meaning. During this period, motherhood anchored her daily life. Raising 2 children who had already experienced disruption demanded consistency without rigidity. Routine became ritual. Mornings were structured. Afternoons centered on schoolwork and conversation. Evenings were quiet by design. The world outside remained unpredictable, but inside the home, predictability became a form of love. She did not romanticize this work. Parenting was not a redemption arc. It was labor, repetitive and often invisible, but essential. The fear she carried from earlier intrusions and losses never fully disappeared. Instead, it was managed, acknowledged, and redirected. She learned how to interrupt panic before it reached her children, how to breathe through moments that threatened to overwhelm. Healing was not an event. It was maintenance. When Brian Randall entered her life, the shift was subtle but profound. He did not arrive as rescue. He arrived as reinforcement. Their partnership did not erase her vigilance, but it softened it. Together, they built a household where strength did not require armor. That sense of balance was fragile, though neither pretended otherwise. When illness appeared, it did not announce itself with drama. It crept in, dismantling the future one small function at a time. The choice to keep his diagnosis private was not denial. It was strategy. Childhood should not be lived under a countdown. They preserved normalcy not because it was easy, but because it was protective. Sandra's life narrowed again, this time by necessity rather than choice. Caregiving reorganized her days and nights. She learned patience beyond fatigue, presence beyond comfort. The industry watched her disappear without explanation. She did not offer one. Care did not need justification. Loss, when it finally came, did not arrive as shock. It arrived as completion. And with it came an absence that changed the texture of every room. Grief settled into routines, altering them without replacing them. In the weeks that followed, there was no grand gesture of mourning. There was only continuation. Children still needed guidance. The house still needed rhythm. Life did not pause to acknowledge devastation. The cruelty of timing returned when public controversy resurfaced around a film long associated with her name. Accusations spread without nuance. Demands were made without context. She became, once again, a screen onto which others projected anger and judgment. The temptation to respond publicly must have been enormous. Silence, however, was familiar territory. She had learned that not every accusation deserves oxygen. Protecting what remained fragile mattered more than correcting strangers. Her restraint was not weakness. It was prioritization. By choosing not to engage, she prevented a second invasion, one emotional rather than physical. Over time, her life began to reflect a different kind of authority. Not the authority of stardom, but the authority of boundaries. Her philanthropic work continued quietly, directed toward disaster relief, child welfare, and humanitarian causes, often without publicity. Giving was not leveraged for narrative. It was practiced as responsibility. When she appeared publicly, it was deliberate and limited, aligned with values rather than promotion. Aging, for her, did not trigger negotiation. She did not chase youth or attempt to freeze time. Physical care was approached pragmatically. Movement, rest, consistency. Beauty became stewardship rather than preservation. Lines of fatigue were accepted as evidence of having lived fully rather than errors to correct. As she approached 61, the contours of her life revealed a pattern. Repeated exposure to loss had not hardened her. It had clarified her. She knew what she would no longer trade for approval. She knew where safety mattered more than acclaim. She understood that dignity is not passive, but enacted daily through restraint, care, and refusal to exploit pain. Part 4 of her story is not about reinvention. It is about consolidation. A life stripped of illusion, governed by intention, and sustained by the quiet discipline of choosing what and who deserves access. By the time Sandra Bullock crossed into her early 60s, the public narrative surrounding her had grown strangely incomplete. From the outside, it looked like withdrawal, a fading presence in an industry that rewards constant motion. But inside her life, something else was taking shape. This phase was not about disappearance. It was about consolidation of meaning. After decades of being watched, interpreted, and consumed, she began to live in a way that no longer required translation. The grief she carried after Brian Randall's death did not resolve itself into clarity or closure. It settled instead into a quieter permanence, something that moved with her rather than against her. Loss became part of the architecture of her days, not an event to be processed and left behind, but a condition to be lived alongside. For someone who had already learned how quickly safety can be taken, this was not unfamiliar terrain. What changed was scale. This loss was not scandal or fear or betrayal. It was the absence of a presence that had made ordinary life feel anchored. And that kind of absence does not announce itself loudly. It appears in pauses, in reflexes that misfire, in moments where the body remembers before the mind does. She continued because she had to, not because endurance felt noble. Children still needed guidance. Schedules still existed. The future, however fragile, still demanded structure. In that sense, motherhood once again shaped the terms of survival. She did not attempt to shield Louis and Isla from grief entirely. She understood that silence can be as destabilizing as exposure. What she offered instead was containment. Grief was acknowledged, but not allowed to dominate the emotional climate of the home. Sadness could exist without becoming chaos. This balance required constant attention. It meant monitoring her own emotional state with discipline, recognizing when sorrow threatened to overflow and redirecting it inward or outward through care rather than collapse. This was not stoicism. It was responsibility. At the same time, the world outside did not soften its gaze. Even as she stepped back from promotion and public engagement, commentary continued. Some framed her absence as retreat, others as decline. Both missed the point. She had reached a stage where visibility was no longer proof of relevance. Her career had already established permanence. What mattered now was agency. Financial independence gave her leverage rarely afforded to women in Hollywood, especially as they age. Her wealth was not a symbol of excess, but of insulation. It allowed her to say no without fear, to pause without explanation, to prioritize health and family over momentum. In this sense, success became a tool rather than an identity. Professionally, she did not abandon storytelling. She shifted its scale. Through her production work, she continued to develop projects quietly, favoring narratives rooted in emotional truth rather than spectacle. The stories that interested her now were not vehicles for reinvention, but reflections of complexity. She gravitated toward characters shaped by contradiction, by restraint, by moral ambiguity rather than easy triumph. This mirrored her own evolution. The industry often celebrates reinvention as spectacle, but her transformation was internal. She had already proven range. What she sought now was alignment. Her philanthropy followed the same pattern. Over the years, she had donated tens of millions to disaster relief, education, and humanitarian causes. What distinguished her giving was not scale, but consistency. She did not attach her name to every contribution. She did not leverage generosity for narrative advantage. Giving was treated as obligation rather than branding. This restraint reflected a deeper philosophy. Attention, in her view, was a finite resource that should not be squandered. When she spoke publicly, it was measured. When she appeared, it was intentional. Aging, too, was approached without negotiation. She did not perform youth or attempt to erase time. Physical care remained disciplined but pragmatic. Movement was prioritized over intensity. Rest over punishment. The body was treated as something to be maintained, not conquered. In interviews, when they occurred, she spoke less about appearance and more about sustainability. At this stage, beauty was not an aspiration. It was stewardship. There was also the matter of solitude. After years of partnership, followed by loss, she did not rush to fill the absence. Companionship was no longer equated with completion. Love, for now, was directed inward and toward her children. This was not resignation. It was discernment. She understood that vulnerability carries cost, and she was unwilling to expose her children to instability disguised as romance. Any future connection would have to coexist with the boundaries she had built, not dismantle them. In this way, grief refined rather than diminished her standards. What emerges in this chapter is a portrait of power redefined. Not power as dominance or influence, but power as self-governance. She controlled access to her time, her energy, and her narrative. She chose when to engage and when to retreat. She understood that dignity is maintained not by performance, but by consistency. The public often frames resilience as something dramatic, forged in moments of visible triumph. Her resilience looked different. It was repetitive. It was quiet. It was practiced daily in choices that never made headlines. By the time she reached 61, Sandra Bullock was no longer proving anything. She had already survived betrayal, fear, intrusion, illness, and death. What remained was not invincibility, but clarity. She knew what she could carry and what she would refuse to carry for others. Part 5 of her story is not about recovery or reinvention. It is about authority earned through loss and the discipline of living in a way that honors what has been taken without allowing it to define what remains. As Sandra Bullock moved deeper into her 60s, The shape of her life revealed something that fame alone never grants: authorship. After decades of reacting to opportunity, expectation, and crisis, she began to live from a place that no longer required response. This did not mean disengagement from the world, but a recalibration of how and where she allowed herself to exist within it. Loss had already stripped away illusion. What followed was refinement. She became deliberate not out of caution, but out of respect for the life she was responsible for sustaining. The children she raised were no longer toddlers shielded by proximity, but growing individuals forming their own understanding of the world. This brought a new responsibility. Protection could no longer rely solely on control of environment. It required modeling. How she responded to grief, judgment, and uncertainty would become part of their emotional vocabulary. That awareness governed her decisions. She chose consistency over commentary, routine over reaction. Even when public narratives shifted or resurfaced controversies attempted to pull her back into explanation, she held her line. Silence, in this phase of her life, was not avoidance. It was instruction. It taught her children that not every accusation deserves an answer, that dignity does not require defense, and that self-worth is not negotiated publicly. This lesson extended beyond motherhood into her broader presence. The industry, accustomed to cycles of return and reinvention, learned to stop waiting for her next move. She was no longer moving to satisfy demand. She was moving when alignment existed. Projects that did reach completion carried her imprint not as spectacle, but as restraint. Even when she stepped in front of the camera, there was no urgency to reclaim relevance. Her performances, when they appeared, were anchored in experience rather than ambition. She understood that emotional authority cannot be rushed. It is accumulated through lived understanding, not repeated exposure. Financial security amplified this autonomy. With independence came insulation, not isolation. She remained connected to causes that reflected her values, particularly those centered on children, disaster recovery, and vulnerable communities. Yet she continued to reject performative philanthropy. There were no campaigns built around her generosity, no calculated visibility designed to convert goodwill into narrative leverage. Giving was not a strategy. It was maintenance of responsibility. This distinction mattered to her because she understood how quickly compassion can be commodified. By keeping her contributions quiet, she preserved their integrity. Aging also brought a different relationship with time. The urgency that once drove her career had dissolved. Days were structured but not packed. There was room for pause, for reflection, for rest that did not require justification. Physical care followed this philosophy. Movement remained part of her routine, but it was approached as preservation rather than optimization. Strength was measured by longevity, not intensity. She listened to her body with the same attentiveness she had learned to give others. There was no attempt to negotiate with age or resist its evidence. Lines, fatigue, and softness were accepted as markers of endurance rather than decline. This acceptance extended to her emotional life as well. Grief, particularly after Brian Randall's death, did not resolve into something manageable or finite. It evolved. Some days it receded into the background. Other days it resurfaced without warning. She did not attempt to cure it. She learned how to coexist with it. This coexistence shaped her understanding of resilience. Strength was no longer defined by recovery, but by accommodation. By making space for sorrow without allowing it to dominate. By continuing forward without demanding that pain explain itself. In private moments, she returned often to the idea of presence. Being there fully even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. This principle guided her interactions with her children as they navigated their own questions and losses. She did not offer easy reassurances. She offered steadiness. The kind that does not promise that everything will be fine, but demonstrates that whatever arrives can be carried. Over time, this steadiness became her most enduring influence. Not as an actress, but as a human being modeling a way to live after repeated rupture. The public, when it noticed her at all, often misread this quiet as retreat. In truth, it was consolidation. She had already lived through extremes of attention and absence. What remained was discernment, knowing when to engage, when to withdraw, and when to simply remain. By the end of this chapter, Sandra Bullock's life no longer fit easily into familiar celebrity frameworks. She was not a comeback story. She was not a cautionary tale. She was something more difficult to categorize. A woman who had absorbed extraordinary pressure without exporting it, who had endured loss without weaponizing it, and who had chosen to live in a way that protected what was still growing rather than chasing what had already passed. Part 6 of her story is about this quiet mastery, the ability to live without explanation, to stand without spectacle, and to let a life shaped by grief become one defined not by what was taken, but by how carefully what remained was held. By the time Sandra Bullock's story reaches its final chapter, it no longer asks to be judged by the standards that once defined her. Awards, earnings, cultural impact. Those measures belong to an earlier era of her life, one shaped by ascent and visibility. What remains now is quieter, harder to quantify, and far more instructive. At 61, she stands as someone who has outlived the need for validation and learned instead how to live with consequence. Her legacy is not sealed in film reels or box office ledgers. It is carried forward in the way she has chosen to inhabit loss without becoming its echo. She has been tested in ways that fame does not prepare you for. Betrayal arrived publicly, stripping away the illusion that success guarantees safety. Fear arrived privately, invading spaces meant to be secure. Illness arrived patiently, dismantling a future she had finally allowed herself to trust. Death arrived without compromise, leaving absence where partnership had lived. And judgment arrived cruelly timed, demanding explanation when grief had already consumed every spare breath. At each turn, she faced a choice that few see clearly in the moment, whether to harden or to hold. She chose to hold, not loudly, not theatrically, but with discipline. That discipline became the defining feature of her later life. It governed how she raised her children, how she managed grief, how she responded to public noise, and how she allocated her energy. She did not confuse privacy with secrecy or silence with weakness. Silence, for her, became a tool of protection. It kept her children from becoming collateral. It kept her pain from being repurposed. It kept her life intact when spectacle threatened to fracture it. In a culture that rewards confession and visibility, her refusal to perform suffering was a radical act. It asserted that some experiences are not meant to be shared, debated, or monetized. They are meant to be lived, endured, and integrated. As time passed, the world gradually adjusted to her absence from constant view. New stars emerged. Trends shifted. The industry moved on, as it always does. But something enduring remained. Her presence, when it appeared, carried weight precisely because it was rare. She did not compete with youth or novelty. She occupied a different register altogether, one defined by credibility. Audiences trusted her not because she was flawless, but because she was restrained, because her performances, like her life, did not ask to be believed. They asked to be felt. This credibility extended beyond her work. It shaped how she was perceived as a public figure navigating aging, motherhood, and grief. She did not frame her life as inspiration. She did not package resilience as a lesson. Yet the example was unmistakable. Strength does not always look like recovery. Sometimes it looks like maintenance, like waking up, showing up, and choosing care again, even when nothing has improved. Sometimes it looks like refusing to let pain become the loudest thing in the room. As her children grew, they did so inside an environment shaped by this philosophy. They learned that love is not proven by promises, but by consistency. That fear can be acknowledged without surrendering to it. That loss does not excuse cruelty. These are not lessons delivered in speeches. They are absorbed through observation, through watching someone choose steadiness when collapse would be understandable. In this way, her influence moved from public to generational. The most meaningful impact of her life may never be visible to an audience. It will unfold quietly in the values passed on, in the emotional literacy modeled, in the refusal to let damage dictate destiny. That is not a story Hollywood knows how to tell well. It lacks spectacle. It resists climax. It is not resolved neatly, but it is real, and it is rare. If tragedy once defined the moments that threatened to break her, character now defines the way she continued. Not unscarred, not untouched, but intact. Sandra Bullock's life, viewed in full, offers a truth that endures long after applause fades. That dignity is not granted by success. It is practiced. That love is not proven by permanence, but by presence. And that the quiet courage to live with integrity, even when no one is watching, is the truest legacy anyone can leave behind.